guys, these are your Chapter 1, Section 2 notes. So that should be the heading for these notes. You should make the heading Chapter 1, Section 2 notes. There's the objectives for this section. There's also some key terms, which can also be found in your book. It's just words that are going to be seen in this section and their definitions. And key terms continued. This is your focus question for today. What are some forms of government in the world? There it lists some examples of what the answers you could have given in your focus question, but we will go over all of the different, or most of the forms of government in the world today in the rest of this PowerPoint. Remember, you're only writing on your notes what I tell you to write or what I underline while I'm talking. You do not have to write everything in this PowerPoint. That's way too much to write. So your first subheading will be direct democracy. That's going to be the first type of government we're talking about. So in a direct, or it can be called a pure democracy, the people pass laws by discussing and voting on them. Okay? So in a direct democracy, the people pass the laws by discussing and voting on them. If you have to pause, that's fine. To get everything written down, then just unpause and move to the next section. Notice it says this system works only in small communities. That's not something that we could do in our state or in our country. So the next one is an indirect democracy. That's the other type of democracy. So in an indirect or representative democracy, as it is also called, the people elect agents who make laws, who make and carry out the laws. That is what we do in the state of Tennessee, in Greene County, and in the United States. These representatives rule with the consent of the governed and can be removed by the people with an election at any time. So what you need to know in this part, in this bullet, is just that these representatives can be removed by the people at election time. So the difference between direct and indirect. In a direct democracy, the people actually vote and make the laws themselves. In an indirect democracy, you elect agents, aka representatives or senators for your state, and those representatives make and carry out the laws. And we have these representatives based on elections. So for the next heading, you're going to write example democracies. We're going to talk about some different examples of democracies around the world. So example democracies is your heading, your next heading. And underneath that heading, you're going to write about the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom is a constitutional monarchy. Most power lies with the Parliament, which is elected by the people. So their election process, they elect people to their Parliament, whereas in the United States, we elect people to Congress. So there are some slight differences between our kind of democracy and the United Kingdom's kind of democracy. Something else about the United Kingdom's democracy, we all know about the Queen of England So the queen or whoever is the monarch of that time, so that's the queen for right now. The queen is the head of the state, while the head of the government is the prime minister, so the prime minister is the head of the leading party in parliament. So the UK has political parties like the United States, and the prime minister is the head of whichever party is the majority of the parliament. The queen is the head of the state. The head of the government is the prime minister in the United Kingdom. So more examples continued of democracies around the world. Here is the United States. So the United States is a constitution-based federal republic. That's a very long title, but that is the kind of democracy that we have. We have a constitution-based federal republic. So what does that mean? That means that the president and members of Congress are chosen by the people through elections. The president is both chief of state and the head of the government, whereas in the UK, the queen or the monarch was the head of state or the chief of state, and the head of the government was the prime minister. In the United States, the president is in charge of both. He is the chief of state and in charge of the government. All right, so your next heading should be dictatorships. Dictatorships. That's our next example of governments around the world today. So your next subheading is going to be dictatorships. And now it's going to talk about different kinds of dictatorships. So your first bullet is going to talk about an autocracy. In an autocracy, one person holds total political power, while in an oligarchy, a small elite group shares political power. So there's two different kinds of dictatorships: the autocracy and the oligarchy. We're going to go into that more. Here it talks about that both forms what you need to know about these two different types of dictatorships is that both are forms of dictatorships, and they hold absolute and unchallenged authority over the people. The people have no say in the government. They don't get to vote. They have no say in what happens in their government. Here's some examples of some dictatorships. So your next heading will say example dictatorships. What are some examples? So underneath that, your first bullet would be some dictatorships are like that of China. So like that of China. And in China, people can vote, but only for candidates from one political party. And also, China's legislator does whatever the dictatorship says. So the people do get to vote, but only for certain people. And the legislator is still going to do whatever the dictatorship says, not what the people have voted or asked for. Another dictatorship is like the one in Myanmar, where the military rules. So in Myanmar, the military rules and there are no elections. The military is in charge of the government. All right, your next heading is unitary government. What is a unitary government? So in your bullet underneath that, you need to write that in a unitary model, all power belongs to the central government, which may grant some powers to local governments. So in a unitary government, the big government controls mostly everything, and they will grant some power to the smaller governments if they choose. The powers of the central government can be limited, is what that word says right there. Limited. They may be limited or unlimited. The other thing that you do need to know about a unitary government is that most governments in the world are unitary in form. Power resides with the central government and the local government comes second, which is the United States government. We have a federal government, which is in charge of the entire country. And we have a state government, which is in charge of the state that we live in. So now we're going to talk a little bit about your next heading, which should be the federal government. And underneath the federal government, what you need to know is that in the federal model, power is divided between a central government and several local governments. That's our type of government. We have a federal government, and then there's local governments and state governments. The U.S. and some 25 other states have federal forms of government. The next heading that you will write is the Confederate government. The Confederate government. And underneath that, you need to know that a confederation is an alliance of independent governments that grant limited powers, usually involving defense or foreign affairs, to a central government. So a confederation is an alliance of independent governments that grant a limited power to the central government. And an example is the European Union is similar to a confederation. Most power belongs to the local governments, and the central government has limited power. The next type of government, and your next heading, is the presidential government. A presidential government divides executive and legislative power between two branches. So there are two branches in a presidential government. The details of this separation of powers are usually spelled out in some sort of constitution. There's a picture that kind of breaks down how a presidential government works. The two branches are independent, but they're co-equal. The next type of government, and your next heading, is parliamentary government. Parliamentary government. In a parliamentary government, the legislator chooses the executive, which is part of the legislator and is under the legislator's control. We will pause here. Please click on the second video to finish Chapter 1, Section 2 notes.